Hi, I'm going to go over my artifacts that I've chosen, my 5 artifacts. Um, I think others have said this has been a very hard week, very labor-intensive week to get through, and I agree. I know we still have lots of work to go, but I think this is a good start, and it was a good exercise for me to kind of go back through and see and kind of review everything that I've done so far. So good exercise. I did, and I also like the mind maps that we created. I thought that was a lot of fun. So the first artifact I chose was the paper I wrote in my very first class, other than the intro class, and it was the history of rock and roll, which I was very excited to take, as I mentioned before. And I wrote my paper on disco and kind of defended its place in rock and roll history. So some of the threads that I came up with, disco was kind of a unique time period in culture. I was around then. I wasn't quite old enough to be going to clubs. Not well, I probably caught the tail end of it, and I did love to go dancing, but disco influenced movies, music, of course, dance, culture, fashion, all of that. And it also had a lot of stories to tell, that like Studio 54 in New York, for instance, or the story of how John Travolta, came up, from Saturday Night Fever. There was a lot of sex and drugs involved in the disco scene, so sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But I think I enjoyed successfully defending disco's place in music history and in rock and roll history. So that was um, my first artifact. My second artifact was on my critical thinking, in my critical thinking on current issues class, which was a philosophy class, and it was about the morality of recreational drug use. And so again, kind of tying in, disco there was cocaine was the disco drug. And so in this paper, I kind of had to take both sides of the issue. Is it morally wrong for people to recreationally use drugs? Does it hurt anybody but themselves? Is the harm to yourself necessarily wrong? Is if it leads to addiction, does that make it wrong? That kind of thing. So some of the words that I used were, harm, no harm, whether it's right to alter your mind, particularly when it may affect another while you're driving or something like that. Addiction, how that affects families and society in general, relationships. Hereditary, you hear a lot about people with addictions that, their children have addictions and their grandchildren have addictions. And so, yeah, is there harm there? Or is it just because the absence of pain should be our right, is psychological pain, as the recreational drug use taking away psychological pain, and so therefore it's a benefit. So my conclusion on that was just say no. I'm very liberal in most every instance, but when it comes to drug use, I am just unapologetically against it. So anyway, that was my second artifact, and I really got a lot out of that paper trying to defend the right to use recreational drugs. So my next was my death and dying class, and Shauna was in that class with me, and so it's been a while, but as I recall, it was definitely one class I kind of dreaded because, nobody likes to face that part of life, the inevitable, but I got a whole lot out of it. And my paper was on funerals and trends in end-of-life care and then after-death care. So everything from, hospice and that type of, how that's chosen here or whether your family takes care of you as you die, or you're, you know, that type of thing. And then funerals and the different cultures, how they treat their dead. There was a really interesting article I found, and I have to look back again. I think it was National Geographic, but it was about how there's a culture in Africa that after the person passes, they stay in their house for many months until they're mummified, basically. They live with their dead until they have like a yearly ceremony where everybody, all the families take their dead to kind of bury them and honor them all at once. So there you are going about your day-to-day life, and you know, grandma's in the corner being mummified. So it's very unusual, but they have a very that particular culture has a very good relationship to their dead. So anyway, that was interesting, and reading those stories, a little bit about history, you know, how Americans, you know, fit funeral business, that type of thing. So it was, I think it helped. I think anytime you are dealing and facing the topic of death head on, and you have to talk about it pretty much on a daily basis, I think it's a little cathartic. So anyway, that was the artifact I chose from that class. My next, the sciences was, no, that was the sciences. My next was my Women Around the World class. So that was another one of my favorite classes. I know I can't have all favorite classes, but this was definitely, I learned a lot about women around the world. And I did my last project was a PowerPoint, and it was on Gloria Steinem. And not too long before that, I had the opportunity to meet her at a book signing. I mean, briefly meet her. I heard her speak and got my book signed. So I can't say that you know, we had an in-depth conversation or anything, but I did get to hear her speak in person, and it was a great day, great afternoon. And she signed her latest book, which was actually a book about, it was a little bit about her history, but it was about stories of women that and people, not just women, that she's met through her life, and some of their stories that she wanted to tell. So, and how they had influenced, you know, what she did and what she's accomplished. And anyway, she's had quite an interesting life, and she's always been a role model. And I really enjoyed putting that PowerPoint together, and hope you know, I could easily expand on that artifact. There's an endless supply of interesting stuff about Gloria Steinem. So, and then my last artifact was the report I wrote for my Banned and Burned books. I love literature. I love my other literature class as well, but we're kind of limited in what we can supply here. So this artifact was the paper I wrote about In Cold Blood, and the whole everything surrounding the publishing of the book, and then later on the movie, including Truman Capote, his relationship with Harper Lee, his relationship with the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, his relationship with the murderers that he wrote about. It was the first nonfiction novel. I've always been fascinated with true crime stories, and In Cold Blood and Helter Skelter were two of the first books that I read, true crime books that I read, that I just, I think gave me a lifelong journey towards that path of hearing these stories. And, you know, it probably sounds macabre, but it's just always been a fascination of mine and anytime someone can write and kind of get inside the mind of a murderer, it's fascinating. I mean, it's scary and horrible and all that, but anyway, and plus it took place in Kansas. You know, Truman Capote came here with Harper Lee, who's, you know, another one of my idols, and unfortunately, it was before my time, but you know, having those landmarks and that type of everything was really interesting to me, and I found out more about the background of the story in writing this paper. So that was my last artifact. And so then my common concepts, or my threads, I guess you could say, I kind of, it's pretty sparse, but I kind of tried to just do words that I thought, and that's probably backwards, but words that I thought really tied everything together. And empowerment, kind of with the characters and the people that are involved in each of the topics. I think I tried to look for a story where someone was empowered in each of my papers or creations that I did. And so that was a big one for me. Relationships, the relationships between people, and how their culture influences that is especially fascinating to me. So history, culture, and stories are my big three, I think. I think you are your history, you are your past, it creates you. Not that you can't start over every day, everybody obviously can, but stories are big right now. It's kind of a catchphrase, if you will. Everybody wants to know your story. Even a story of a product is big within, you know, advertising right now. But I truly believe that's how we learn, is hearing someone else's story, and finding a way to tell your own. So anyway, that was my artifacts. Thank you for listening.